Here's my quilt back, and now it's time to add the patchwork piece. First I'm going to add a piece of batting, and I'm actually going to flip it up and mark where my center edges are. So this is the line I drew. Just going to mark it on the outside of the batting as best I can. Sometimes pins are the best solution. And my batting is just a little bit bigger than my quilt back piece once it's lined. Accuracy is not required for cutting this piece of batting. Just make sure it's big enough to cover the back piece. With my patchwork piece centered, I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and I'm going to put red thread in the upper thread, and I'm going to leave the cream colored thread in the bobbin, and I'm going to stitch around the edges about a 1/16 of an inch from the edge of the square all around the red square. I'm also going to stitch the inside part. With a quilt, I like to do this stitching through all the layers. I like to do it from the center out. If I start at this end, inevitably things get pushed over and it doesn't work out as well. So I always start from the center out. And what I'll do is I'll probably start stitching actually right here in the red center here, and then cut my threads and move to the outside of the square. So pin it, but if you need to move the pins while you're stitching, go ahead and do that. But I'm going to sew through all the layers, holding everything together as I sew. You may have noticed that I've left long thread tails. I do this because I like to thread them through the project and not trim them close to the edge, and that way they're less likely to unravel. So I'm going to zoom in and show you how I do that. So I have something called a self-threading needle. It's got an opening at the top, and I just floss the thread through there and then weave the needle into my fabric, and then I trim the edges after I bring it back out again. So if you pull the thread a little bit, not a lot, it disappears into the quilt and you won't have it raveling. So that's just something that I do because I don't like knots. But if you want to backstitch, that's fine too. For the rest of the pad stitching, you don't have to sew these blue squares down in the middle, but I'm going to run a row of crisscross across the center seam just to keep them as flat as possible. Then I'm going to sew these squares down. When sewing these squares down, I discovered a way to do it with unbroken stitches, and I'm going to demonstrate it using post-it notes. I'm going to start my stitching here. So this is row 1. Then I'm going to turn the corner here, and that's row 2. Then I'm going to turn the corner here. That's 3. Now I can either cross to this side or stitch here. It's up to you. But that's row 4. Row 5. Turn the corner. 6. 7. 8. 9. 10. And they're all stitched down. Let's review the parts that are required to make the table runner side panels. You're going to need 2 backs that have already been lined with their center lines marked. You're going to need batting cut about the size of the backs, lined backs. And then you're going to need the decorative panels that were pieced. Start by laying the batting on top of the lined back pieces of the quilt side panels. Using a marker suitable for fabric, transfer the marks of the center onto the batting. Position the pieced panels over top of the back and the batting, lining up the edges of the diamond shapes with the centers and pin. Make sure all 4 centers match. The stitching I'm about to do is known as pad stitching. It goes through all layers of the quilt. It holds the quilt together. The distance between pad stitches is determined by the batting. I'm using batting that will maintain its shape and integrity even if the stitches are placed 10 inches apart. Be sure and check your batting and any instructions that come with it to determine how much space can be between pad stitching. Because I'm using this batting, only sewing around the rectangles or the squares will be perfectly fine for keeping this quilt together. Once the panels are pinned in place, I'm going to change my thread to red on the top, and I'm going to keep cream in the bobbin because that's the dominant color of the back, and I'm going to stitch about a 1/16 inch away from the edge of the red diamond all the way around. I'm going to do both pieces. Then I'm going to change to blue thread in the top and do the blue diamonds. Here are the table runner side panels. I still have threads hanging out because I'm going to thread a needle with them and tuck them under one layer of fabric to hide the thread ends in my table runner side panels. But after that, I'm going to attach them to the center panel of the table runner.